Let's get started. Welcome to all of you. Can you hear me at the back? The sound good. Okay. We're in for a treat. We've got two amazing speakers who are going to share with us, starting with Crispian Olver. I think many of you will know his history. I love the way, I think, Crispian, you've wrote this. He describes himself anti-apartheid activist, innovative government bureaucrat, a fearless corruption investigator, and a ruthless, honest author. And I think we're going to get a flavor of that today. So, Crispian, thank you very much. And then Ferial Haffajee, we know as one of South Africa's top editors and newspaper editors and journalists. She has worked for the City Press as editor, previously editor of the Mail and Guardian, and then most recently, associate editor for the Daily Maverick. So what we have here is a conversation between very articulate, very thoughtful people. And it really is going to go as a conversation. I think Ferial's going to kick us off, and then we'll take it from there, and then there'll be a little bit of time for questions at the end. I just want to say that I've actually read the book. And the book, as you know from your description of the event, is the same title of the session here, A House Divided. I was drawn to the book. I actually found it in an exclusive bookstore in the library in Cape Town, in the exclusive bookstore in the airport in Cape Town on my way to Joburg looking for something to read. But I was drawn to it because at the time, and I think this was around October, there was quite a lot of press around the Philippine Horticulture Association. And having lived in Cape Town for a long time, I felt that this issue kept coming into the press and then disappearing, coming into the press. And I felt I've lived here for too long not to actually know more about what this issue is. And so I read that chapter, it's called The Promised Land. I read that chapter with great interest. And then, of course, the water crisis, which affected all of us, is really the entree into the book. But chapter by chapter takes us behind the scenes in quite sobering, harrowing ways around the way in which our city, quote unquote, works for us. And so I'm particularly grateful for these kind of insights. So I'm going to hand it over to Ferial and hand it to you.
Is a very good person to take us through. I mean, just when we think that your politics is really the showstopper, I read this week about the goings on at the Cape High Court with some amazing, that was quite a story about Judge John Slope and Constantia. Is that better? Okay, I'll say it again. So you live in a really exciting city. I think that the politics which Chippy will walk us through has certainly been top of mind and top of imagination. But this week when I read about the Cape High Court with the Judge President John Slope, against whom a 13-page complaint has been brought by his deputy, wow, that's really, really something that I think deserves a book on its own, Chippy. Yeah. But let's plow right in. So obviously today is a peach of a day in Cape Town, and when you land you can see why it's always claimed as one of the most beautiful capitals on earth. So beautiful, but it seems to me that ever since colonial times, integration has completely evaded the city. Spatial integration, class integration, and I guess that's the underpinning of your book. So I suppose you also grew up in Cape Town, which I didn't know until I read it, and you start with a beautiful story I thought we might share with the friends gathered here today, and it's the story of Hammy. Will you tell us about that?
Sure. Is this on? Okay. I don't want to irritate the audience by being unclear. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ferial. So, you know, as Ferial said, I spent my very early years in Cape Town. It was a special place to be living. I was privileged to grow up in what was then a farming suburb called Constantia. And it wasn't the well-heeled, you know, Constantia that you know of today. It was quite a racially diverse, integrated farming community. There was a little bit of a mink and manure set, but it was integrated to the extent that my best friend from about the ages of 2 until 6 was a young chap called, I called him Gummy, which I suppose is an anglicization of the name. And, you know, we were, as, you know, childhood mates, we were just in love with each other and exploring the vineyards and causing a whole lot of havoc. And then in the middle of the 60s, this group areas machinery starts, you know, trundling through the suburbs. And, you know, that was the period. Okay. That's better. Okay. Then I think I'll take this off. So it was the time of the group areas machinery, and it was starting to work its way through Cape Town. And it, you know, Wynberg, Claremont, Constantia, Takai, all those suburbs. And what they were doing, against the wishes even of the white community in those areas and the city council, was ripping everyone of color out, despite some of them having been attached to the land there for 200 years. I mean, you know, the history ran deep in the suburbs. And then pulling them out to places like Mannenberg and Retreat and Grassy Park. And, you know, I've got this very clear image from about the age of 4 or 5 when the trucks pitched up to take Gummy and his family away, and being utterly unable to comprehend what was going down. I mean, why would people take a family that was living in that area, they'd been there forever, and moving them out? And I'd go and visit Gummy out in Mannenberg, and it was a devastated area. I mean, it was, you know, just plain flat sand. When the wind blew, it was hell on earth. Gummy's mom wouldn't let us play on the road because of, she said there were gangs and crime. And, you know, I eventually stopped going to Mannenberg. And, you know, when I moved on into high school, I went to Natal and I lost touch with the family completely. But a few years after they were moved, Gummy's dad committed suicide. So he just couldn't hold the family together. They'd lost their jobs when they moved out there. So it was, I mean, you know, I was a privileged white middle-class person living in a suburb. But something deep was, you know, it struck, you know, no one in my community would talk about this. There was almost like a code of silence that we collectively bought into. And I went to junior school. There wasn't a single black kid in the school. You know, by the time I went to high school, they were doing the big move to Mitchell's Plain. They were still tearing down bits of District 6. And the reason I tell the story is not to, you know, I mean, well, there's huge hurt and injustice, but I tell it because you can't understand Cape Town today without understanding that history. And the way that the city was pulled apart and people's lives were smashed in that process. And there's an underbelly of pain and hurt and injustice in the city. And I feel it as a, you know, I come back to Cape Town and I have this feeling of sadness that
runs inside me. It's like a seam. And I had a friend called Stephen Watson who was a poet and I think much loved by the Cape Town community. They used to live in Kalk Bay. And Stephen wrote about this terrible, unfinished project that Cape Town is. How it's not yet reached closure about where it is as a city and as a place. And to redress it, I mean, we can all say, well, yes, of course, we want to see redress and we'd like to see reintegration. But reintegration has to be an active thing. It can't be a passive thing that we now just say, well, the market will sort it out. It's got to be an active thing of reintegration. So I told the story to really illustrate the spatial character of Cape Town, its dislocation, which, you can drive along this lovely strip that circles the Table Mountain chain, and you think you're living in heaven. It's beautiful, but it has an emptiness to it that if you're aware to it, you suddenly think, oh my God, I'm experiencing this beauty, but it has a hollowness underneath it. And yeah, I love Cape Town. It's beautiful. But there's something deeply sad and unfinished about it. It's a long reply.
Fine, it's lovely. It's just, so that's the underpinning of the book, that's how it starts. And then it's a book that looks at the governance of Cape Town. That's your speciality. You study public administration. In my view, sometimes we journalists don't give honor to our craft of telling what it is to remake a country, and that too often we get caught up in only covering party politics, which is why I so much enjoy your field of public administration. So the book, a large part of it, and I guess that's because you were doing the research then, deals with the contemporary crisis of that period, and it was the coming day zero in Cape Town. So just a quick show of hands. Who of you had to make radical life adjustments as you began to realize that the city was running out of water so quickly? I would guess it's most people. My favorite story was when I went to visit my darling Auntie Daria here. Suddenly, if you had to go to a loo, it was, don't flush. I was like, what the hell? And then she started telling me about how her life had to change. And I think it resulted in important behavioral changes. So that's the prism through which you explore public administration and the story of the House Divided. What did you find? How did you come to understand how poorly prepared Cape Town was and why it resulted in the crisis in city administration?
Yeah. There was an amazing show of hands. I mean, it shows the extent to which this monumental crisis affected everyone, very deeply in the way that you live your lives and go about your business. So I was recovering from having written How to Steal a City, and having been through quite a traumatic period. But I had a niggling question in my head about, I'd seen this monumental corruption and mismanagement in Port Elizabeth. But I was wanting to look at deeper issues about how cities function and to what extent vested interests, even old vested interests, are able to attach themselves to different parts of the city administration. And it was the time that, you were in the depths of the water crisis already. And it was very clear that the city was not on top of it. and they were just starting to roll out the communications around day zero. And then all these stories started coming out, and I mean, the one thing you've really got is a depth of journalistic quality in the city. I mean, you've got some of the best investigative journalists in the country, other than Ferial. But maybe she'll come live here one day.
No.
Joe Berger, yeah. So, and those stories started to show that Cape Town had known about the water crisis at least 10 years earlier. And this document came out, which was a deal that had been struck between the City of Cape Town and the Department of then Water Affairs and Forestry. And it was at the time that they were doing the big Berg River transfer scheme, which was the sort of last big national infrastructural intervention. And at the time of doing that infrastructure scheme, they had noted that Cape Town would, on current demand projections, would run out of water in 2019. Run out of water in 2019. And there was a deal struck in terms of which, so the dividing line, and it is a grey area. I mean, look, we have a constitution that gives powers around water resource management nationally and water services to local government. And the province has got very little other than disaster management. So it's a little bit of a mishmash. But they'd struck a deal in which they agreed that the City of Cape Town would take responsibility for all other surface water augmentation. Now, that would ordinarily include, reusing and recycling water, tapping into the aquifer, doing desalination of one form or another, and water conservation and demand-side management. So, you've got advance notice of this crisis, and you do nothing about it for 9 of the 10 years, and then in the 9th year you realize you're really in trouble. And what do? You start accusing Cape Townians of being profligate and not saving water. So, they immediately switched in. They tried to do some very emergency procurement around desalination, which was horrendously expensive. It would have pushed your tariffs way through the roof. And they bring in Tony Leon and his company Resolve Communications, which, is a bit questionable. DA-run city, former DA leader. I mean, Tony's good, but there were some hygiene issues raised. And Resolve comes up with this idea of how do we scare the citizens of Cape Town maximally by using this concept of day zero. And, it worked. It drove people to save, even though it was a little bit of a figment because the taps were never actually going to run dry. But there were some real scare stories that, when Helen Zille announced that all of your water would now be dispersed through these water points, and they worked out how many people, 50,000 people, would have to get to each water point. Can you imagine the traffic jams and the fighting? I mean, there'd already been a fight breaking out at the Newlands Spring. And suddenly it looked like there could be a water war in the city. And there was a real, there's a real sense of panic. And I was doing my research at the time, and I'd come and talk to my friends, and everyone spoke about it all day, all night, at dinner parties. It was a big issue. So me, I've got a bit of an inquisitive attitude to things. I wanted to know why does supposedly the best run city in the world, who, has a very good anti-corruption record. They certainly outperform all the other metros. How does the best-run city in South Africa so drop the ball on the biggest crisis in the history of Cape Town? And that's when I started, applying to do research and dig into the administration. And the red flag, I write to the city, I ask if I can come and research and do some interviews. And they say, no, you've got to submit a proper application, and there's this whole bureaucracy that kicks in. We want to see your research proposal. I mean, it's piles of documents. I submitted it, and they come back a couple of weeks later and say, we deny, your research request is turned down because of the risk. So, I mean, that's like, that's a red flag.
For sure. I mean, I was really surprised that your request got turned down because, I mean, Joburg, for all its faults, it's pretty transparent. You can get an interview quite easily. So that did surprise me. So anyway, who of you read How to Steal a City? The book about yes. So I'm not sure if this was your experience if you read both books together. But when I was reading How to Steal a City, I kept going like, oh, like sharp intakes of breath. It was such venal corruption and such naked and blatant theft. So 2 billion rand later, there's no bus rapid transport system still. I haven't seen it. It's not working, right? It's still stuck. Yes, Port Elizabeth. So, but you don't find that in A House Divided. You don't see the blatant theft, the complete the inability of the city administration to govern anything. That's not there. In that sense, it is a tale of two cities. But in the end of their story, you still come to the same sense of a political anemia that these administrations couldn't take their cities into a modernity and into a social justice that works for all of its people at all. They both end up in quite similar ways. So what were the similarities and the differences between these two cities, and what are the different kinds of capture? I thought if you could read for us on page 147, that would be lovely. Huh?
Okay. Yeah, well, look, A House Divided is a slower burn. If you're reading it expecting to find the sort of gung-ho investigator running down the street from the taxi bosses, like in House Divided, it's not there. I'm shut out of the city. I'm not an actor in it. I'm not the sort of anti-corruption czar that's been sent to clean it up. But it's an intriguing mystery. I mean, it's a very painful mystery. You all lived through it and experienced it. I was just looking at it and trying to peel away the layers. So Cape Town is a process of me methodically peeling each layer away. And, having peeled the water crisis away, finding that underneath it, there's been this 2-year period of purging of all of your really good top technical senior managers in the city. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, the person that I write about in the book, Catherine Stone, used to head planning in the city. Cathy is, the quintessential dedicated city bureaucrat. Smart, very precise, doesn't look for fights, does her work in a dedicated way. She's, right across the whole of South Africa, she's widely respected. I spoke to many property developers in the city. They all respect her, even if they disagree with her. And, the list went on. It wasn't just Cathy, it was Cathy's boss, Yarpi, it was the whole human settlements division, the property management people. And the common thread amongst all of those was that at some point they had stood up against their political bosses and said, this is the technical advice, I'm not amending it. You know, I'm not retracting my opinion. You can still go ahead, but I'm not changing my view because I've told you what the science is. Well, that was their death knell. And, you know, it was particularly, you know, your former Mayor Patricia, who is a, you know, a mercurial character, very compelling. She certainly led Cape Town to, in the 2016 local government elections, to its biggest electoral success ever, and she presented a very compelling image of this. You know, she argued for a unified, spatially integrated city that would work for everyone. It was a compelling vision, and you know, a lot of people drank that Kool-Aid and voted for her. She was also a narcissistic bully, and if you disagreed with her, she saw it as an act of disloyalty and turned you into the enemy. And that stands in a little bit of contrast to the former mayor, Helen Ziller, who was also, you know, a bit of a quirky, odd character. If you disagreed with her, she just thought you hadn't understood her properly. So I was then interested, so having looked at this system of purging that was taking place, aided and abetted, by the way, by a whole lot of other actors in the drama, the laptop boys, these... the laptop boys. So the laptop boys are a sort of fascinating anthropological phenomenon. And, well, I could have been a laptop boy in my day, quite frankly. So, you know, they are mostly young. A lot of them are Oxford trained. There's a big link to the Rhodes Scholars. They have little experience in government. They are closely linked to the DA, but they're the sort of technocratic core of the DA. And they get deployed into cities to basically drive the party's agenda down through the administration. Most parties do that kind of thing. But these ones stand out a little bit because of their sort of know-it-all, smarter-than-thou attitudes, and their love of very complicated sort of McKinsey-esque organizational restructuring processes, which, against all of the evidence, and you know, they have very little experience in government, so they drive these very complicated organizational programs and force them onto the administration. And in alliance with Patricia, the laptop boys and Patricia, you know, so they come up with a big organizational restructuring. They want to change all the line accounting and stuff, and they reorganize things. Patricia's got her own interests. So she sees this organizational restructuring as an opportunity to drive out anyone that doesn't agree with her and put all of her people in. So in combination, Patricia and the laptop boys become a toxic vehicle that sets Cape Town's administration back. There's a bunch of deeply traumatized people. I mean, you need to have some sympathy for what goes on in that ghastly building on the Foreshore. There's a bunch of very traumatized people there who need some gentle change management to try and sort of rebuild and heal this organization. And I then peel that layer back, because that's not enough of an explanation of what's going down. And you know, what I'm obviously interested in is, what are the projects and decisions that all of these purges are linked to? And they basically cluster around 5 or 6 big property deals in Cape Town. There are 2 in Philippi, and the story in Philippi, I mean, I think you know the story in Philippi. Philippi is the place in Cape Town where the aquifer comes closest to the surface. And in fact, water gets sucked up into the upper layers and into the roots of the plant. So the original German settlers that started farming there were, farming on, that's why it's so agriculturally productive. The aquifer is closest to the surface. It's also a very important recharge zone for the aquifer. So covering Philippi in concrete is going to stop that recharging process, apart from affecting the food security for the area. The Cape Town planners have done study after study into Philippi. Every study comes back with the same conclusions. It's important agriculturally, it's important for the water resources of the city, it's important culturally, there's archaeological artifacts there, don't develop it. But a succession of politicians and developers have been working out ways to slowly encroach on this Philippi horticultural area. And Patricia set her sights on two big developments, both of them run by very, what I call wide boys. These are, people that play fast and furious with the truth. Their morals are agnostic. They'll, do what has to be done to turn a buck. And we can't see who's been paid off where, but we can see a series of systematic political interventions that are very decidedly favoring a very particular group of property developers and not the farmers or the communities in the area that have been fighting the battle there. And so, that's Philippi. But it's not just Philippi. It's Maiden's Cove, right, on the Atlantic side, where a huge piece of coastal land that's a coastal reserve is basically privatized. And it's privatized over the heads and the wishes of the community there, the Clifton Bungalows Association. It runs against the wishes of the old District 6 community and the Boerkaap community, who all, in the apartheid days, Maiden's Cove was the one beach on the Atlantic side that the coloured population could go and swim in. So there's a deep historical connection to Maiden's Cove. All of the planners recommend against Maiden's Cove, just as they've recommended against Philippi. The common feature between the two is that the planners that make the technical recommendations and don't back the development get fired. The same goes down on the Foreshore. So the whistle, I'm sure you all remember the scandal around the Foreshore. So the whistleblower on the Foreshore development, Frank Cumming, also gets fired by Patricia. The same is going down in the Two Rivers Urban Park next to Observatory, where and in fact here the city is working in cahoots with the province to push this and particularly take the River Club, which is an old historical feature in Observatory, and turn that into a dripping, large, exclusive development. So the stories go on. There are many other property deals I cite there. I've assembled the evidence fairly meticulously so that you can, what I try and do is take you with me so that you can see how each of these deals is going down.
Is it your opinion that this... Okay. Is it your opinion that this stranglehold that the developers seem to have on the city and on the city administration, is that what stops spatial integration from happening? Because you also find that actually while the former Mayor Pat Dillil was a Pan-Africanist, a social justice warrior, an anti-corruption czar, as she now styles herself at the Department of Public Works, that actually none of her projects are about social justice or integrating the city at all.
Yeah. I just realized I'd never read the... you must discipline me, Ferial.
Read that book, it's really nice.
No, well, let me. I'm gonna forget your question. So, you know, the point I made at the beginning is that if we leave this just to the market, it's not going to happen. Because private developers go where the buck is to be turned, and it's not going to be turned in terms of lower income areas. They're not interested in that. They at least want, lower middle class or upper middle class. Those kinds of developments is where you're able to have a revenue base. So you've got to push it. And that doesn't mean that you drive developers to do it without making a profit. Obviously, they have to turn a buck. And there are ways of incentivizing it to happen, but you've got to lean in. And in the process of leaning in, you're going to get some pushback. So you're going to get some, the white residents of Constantia are going to, some of them are going to object when coloured families start being brought back into places that they were evicted from decades ago. You've got to stand up and push that through. And what surprised me was the stories I got from the housing people. And I spoke to almost everyone she had fired in the housing department. They said they'd come to Patricia with a plan for spatial integration. Very ambitious, very bitty. They weren't going to just bring huge swathes of poor people and plonk them down. They were trying to do small social housing programs. They pushed stuff in Woodstock. They pushed stuff in Salt River. They said when the real rubber hit the road and, hard decisions had to be made, all of the leadership, including Patricia, backed off. And that's because there weren't any rents in it. The love that they were getting from the other projects, which I don't think they were necessarily taking for themselves, but they were certainly putting that into the party. And I build the case around that fairly carefully in the book. That love, they didn't get that same love out of social housing. So that surprised me.
Found that very surprising.
Yeah. So this is how did the guys go about capturing the officials and the politicians? So I had this fascinating discussion with the head of the property, with the Western Cape Property Developers Forum, who's actually quite a progressive guy. He's got a difficult constituency to manage. So we're having a chat about, so how does this work? So this is him. How do the guys go about capturing the officials and politicians? One of the developers said, and went on to describe the steady way in which these relationships developed. You start off with a rugby match or a soccer match. You then elevate it to a dinner. You then elevate it to a hunting weekend. You then elevate it to a grant for the kid or a bursary loan. You then elevate it to something else. And eventually the snowballs to the extent that you've actually got the business. That's what they did with Jacob Zuma. Referring to my previous book, he added, you should know. How do you steal a city? Bit by bit. How do you develop? Bit by bit.
I thought that was so clear. I thought we might take a couple of questions. Chippy, it's a font of knowledge and the book's really good. I have many more, but I thought if you have a couple of questions, you're welcome. Anybody? Yes, please, ma'am.
What space is there to challenge these developers as people who might not be journalists and don't know how to access these spaces? And so how do we challenge the developers, the politicians who are providing affordable housing, which is at 1.2 million in flats for a tiny little apartment, and the white Constantiaites who are saying, no, we don't want you people here. How do we challenge all those people? What spaces are there to do that?
Reclaim the city. No. Another question, please? Yes, ma'am. Can you start?
Major problems about resettlement in the Constantia Valley, for example, is that there's not a single piece of paper talking about a single piece of land. Now, very interestingly, there has been a restitution which is called the Constantia Emporium. It was given to the Solomon family, and they have built a large, unwanted shopping centre half a mile away from an existing shopping centre. But adjoining that building, there is a large piece of land
been developed for a ShopRite centre. Unneeded, more than enough centres. Perhaps it's better without. Hello? It's making a lot of noise.
Speaking so softly, ma'am, that's why. Sorry, guys.
Now, the next piece of land to be developed there, also a restitution family, is right now planning application for a BMW showroom. The Constantia Ratepayers Association has asked the city to allow not those developments but low-cost housing. Patricia Below and the city turned completely against that proposal and allow developments, and it's going to be done exactly as we said, in a piecemeal fashion. The balance will also be developed, and I can almost guarantee you that at the end of the whole development, there won't be a single house there.
Everybody hear that? So it's Constantia, a vacant piece of land's been allocated to a BMW dealership, and that the city administration's not responded to calls by residents to make land available for social housing. So we've got 3. I'll come back if we have a chance. Thank you. I see you.
Okay. So, you know, the one thing that's striking about Cape Town is the rich tradition of civic organisation that you've got. And it's been through its ups and downs. I mean, you had that huge flowering of local community civics in the 80s that was part of the push against apartheid. And you've also got a long tradition of ratepayers associations in the largely white suburbs. And I was struck by how on every one of the land issues I was looking at, there's been civic mobilization which has struggled to find traction and an ear with the city. And it was even more sinister because there were then moves for developers and the city to, in fact, white ant and take over some of these civic organizations. And it had been sort of revealed in the Sea Point and Fresno Bantry Bay Residents Association. There were similar moves in Boerkaap, attempts to both capture the civic and the youth in Boerkaap. In fact, they did capture the youth. And then moves in Observatory to take over the Observatory civic organization. And there are probably others I didn't have time to document and capture. But certainly, the one way for people to get involved is to actively join some of these organizations. There's been this campaign in the Philippi horticultural area, which is led by this delightful chap called Nazir Sonde, who's a relentless campaigner. He, as he says, he'd rather be farming, but he's forced to go on to an activist footing in order to secure his right to farm in the Philippi long term. So I think there's a wealth of options to get involved and push this kind of agenda. And at a more practical level, I mean, you've got some great social housing companies in the city who've done already some very innovative social housing projects. And what was tragic was that as part of the sort of coup to take Patricia de Lille out, all of those Woodstock and Salt River projects then got axed and fell by the wayside. And, so even the small tentative steps that were being taken towards a slightly more integrated approach were being bombed. The real gap is that the city's not stepping in and providing the leadership. I spoke to a lot of developers. The developers were saying, we are desperate. Our developments are being held up now by all these objections from the civics. We are ready to strike a deal that will take on, it's called an inclusionary housing policy. We will take on commitments that in our developments we'll provide a certain percentage of lower income developments at a sort of subsidized rate. They're willing to do it, but the city has not been pushing them to finalize a policy and broker this meeting between communities and developers. So I think there's for me, this is the tragedy of Cape Town. You've still got a technically very well-run city. You've got a level of capital in the city that's possible to ambitiously remake the city. But the leadership to do it is not there. And I think as residents of Cape Town, you've got to demand it. And it doesn't matter from which income group or class you come from. You might be white and middle class, but the security of our future depends on us building a more inclusive city that works for everyone. Sitting in an ivory tower clustered around this mountain, you're waiting for a tsunami to come and wash you away. Cape Town's got the resources to do it. It's got the ability, it's got the technical ability, and it's got the capital to do it. The Constantia cases, I mean, I have to say, I don't know the details about them, so I would hate to comment, but it sort of links back to what I'm saying about the role the city should be playing. If you let the city planners have their way, they would have, I think, got the right kinds of developments pushed through. But it's the propensity of the political leaders to approve another shopping centre. Why? Because there's some, rich returns to be made, and we don't know who's got what palms greased as part of that process.
A couple of more questions. I saw a hand there and here and there. Quick ones, please. Oh, thank you.
My question is, there's an enormous amount of land available on Foreshore.
Yeah.
I think it's all SARS, it's railway land.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's enormous, it's such wasted space.
Yeah.
And I want to know why there's never been sold, I think, back to the city in order to create a new.
Yeah.
And I cannot understand that there's District 6 literally flowering up above it. And again, there's Last Valley.
Yeah.
What is happening with that area? It's in the city. It's such a perfect point space.
Yeah.
There's a lovely bit on Foreshore, but Chippy will speak about that now. Yes.
You also, I don't know if you do this in the book, but to peel another layer away from the city and look at organizational culture.
Yeah.
I spent time working with provincial and city health authorities and moving between the two about a decade ago. And the organizational culture I often found in the city was such that it also didn't facilitate deep change. So there was a lot of emphasis on its own mythology about performativity and efficiency and to be seen to be working. And to such an extent that often it was short-term political gains and not actually pulling out all the dirty underwear if necessary and really dealing with problems because we need to be seen to be performing, and a kind of audit culture that actually was quite toxic in the end.
Did I see a hand? I saw your hand, yes. Yes.
I just wanted to ask, is it possible to comment on the public participation process? Because I'm based out of Natal, and we just had a road approved to go through a wetland, which is astonishing.
The community meeting we had, our ward councillor told us just follow the process. But the public participation process is so David and Goliath. It's really a very difficult thing to do, and we are mounting an appeal, but we have met with the Philippine Horticultural Association people, and they tell us you will lose an appeal, it's guaranteed. Put all your money in the review. It feels so stacked against normal residents who are doing this as volunteers.
Okay, so I mean, I write about the Foreshore quite a bit because it obviously is there's this huge tender goes out to develop the Foreshore, and there's meant to be social housing as part of it, although there isn't. And it really is a scheme. I mean, basically the different factions in the city have lined up around different bids. and we don't know what each is getting out of them, but you can see the way that the battle plays out. The Foreshore's basically been divvied up between three big interests, or three or four. So there's Naspers, which owns a huge chunk of the Foreshore, and they've consolidated their land holdings. And that goes all the way back to, when soon after they built the Foreshore. Then there's a wily entrepreneur called George Giorgio, who I'm told has many of the city officials in his pocket. But I just didn't have enough evidence to write about it at any length. And then, of course, there's the V&A waterfront. And then, yes, you're right, there are some big public works buildings which, bless them, they've never been able to do anything creative with. The real controller, though, in the Foreshore is the city, because they own large chunks of land under the freeways, and they've got the regulatory powers to force a deal. In fact, the Foreshore itself is a bit of an artificial thing, because all these players I've mentioned came together, lumped all their properties into a single pool, and then redivided them up with bulk infrastructure attached to it, which was in a way a slightly unholy deal. But the city has the power to force a progressive solution that brings a variety of land uses and interests into that area. And unfortunately, it went completely south over as the different factions locked in around their preferred bids. I agree about the organizational culture. I think it's I write a little bit about it, and the schizophrenia that certainly goes on in the city, and I think to the province to a certain extent, which is, there's this one big push in the DA, which is a good one. It's an anti-corruption push, but they are sticklers for getting a clean audit and sticking by the rules and procedures. And people are in mortal fear of getting a negative audit finding against them. And then there's another stream, which is a sort of cutting red tape stream.